Moscow's Kostomarovskaya Embankment appeared deserted on the evening of September 2nd, 1977. The impression was deceiving. KGB operational teams had deployed every possible resource to secretly monitor the area. One operative had even been suspended in a special mesh bag, hidden in a tree canopy above the river. He would need to cut the rope with a knife and drop to the ground when the moment came. The waiting stretched on endlessly. Finally, the teams received word. Movement detected. The culmination of an operation that had lasted several months was approaching. This espionage story contained all the elements of a masterful thriller. Money, gold, secret caches, codes, classified intelligence, surveillance, pursuits, and naturally, women. Intelligence services use feminine beauty and charm for their operations, not only in books and films, but in the shadows of reality itself. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Soviet counterintelligence monitored radio frequencies around the clock. Against the USSR, approximately 10 intelligence centers operated worldwide, their signals penetrating the airwaves with coded instructions for hidden agents. In January 1977, KGB counterintelligence detected a new radio channel from a CIA development center in Frankfurt. At 2100 Moscow time, on the same frequency, a woman's voice would spend 10 minutes calling out numbers from 1 to 100. Then 10 short audio signals would sound, followed by the word group, after which encrypted transmission would begin in 5-digit clusters. But whom were these messages meant for? The Committee for State Security had recently exposed CIA agent Alexander Ogorodnik, a Soviet diplomat who had worked for American intelligence services for 3 years under the code name Trianon. The Frankfurt transmissions might have been intended for him, but Trianon had taken his own life during arrest. Using his captured cipher tables, the new messages could not be decoded. This meant they were addressed to someone else entirely. The radio signal could only be reliably received in the Tula, Kaluga, and Kursk regions. It seemed the new agent should be sought precisely in this territory. But what could have attracted the Americans to this area? A theory emerged. Transmissions to other regions were merely attempts to mislead Soviet counterintelligence, while the spy actually operated in the capital. KGB technicians managed to construct a special radio receiver attachment that made it possible to listen to transmissions in Moscow. On Vavilov Street in the capital, KGB surveillance photographed something curious on the wall of building number 15, a vertical chalk mark. Perhaps a childish prank, but one American diplomat suspected of CIA work suddenly began passing this location daily. When the mark appeared, he would examine it closely. When it vanished, he returned to his old route. What did this wall marking mean? And why was the American intelligence officer so obviously interested in it? Perhaps this was a signal left by the new agent, indicating readiness to retrieve a container with instructions, money, or espionage equipment at an agreed location. All these signs indirectly confirmed that the CIA truly had a new agent operating in Moscow, someone who had likely been recruited during foreign assignment work and had now returned to the Soviet Union. The Frankfurt transmissions had begun for him. KGB began determining who had returned from abroad during this period. Approximately 40 Soviet citizens had returned from foreign assignments in 1976, 11 of whom had access to state secrets and could interest the CIA. They were placed under surveillance. One former technical employee of a Soviet embassy behaved particularly strangely. He regularly sent postcards to Moscow's main post office requesting pickup, arranging meetings with unknown recipients. Observation revealed he frequently met with several foreigners working for international trading firms. Additionally, he was something of a womanizer, liked to drink, and loved money. A collection of character flaws. Soon, the reason for this employee's meetings with foreigners became clear: ordinary speculation. However, during this time, the Committee for State Security picked up a new trail. Tourists visiting the Soviet capital bought ordinary postcards in enormous quantities, sending friends warm greetings from red or cold Moscow before dropping them in mailboxes. But spies also used these same postcards. Quite often, postcards with secret texts were called letters of concealment. CIA laboratories developed them for agents, with spies applying secret information using special inks between the lines. Such invisible writing could only be detected using specialized equipment. The Committee for State Security began checking postcards from various foreigners visiting Moscow over different time periods. They were written in the same handwriting, and on one letter, let's say the third one, invisible writing was indeed discovered. Only 2 very short fragments could be deciphered, but they provided crucial information. First, the author had recently been on vacation. Second, he worked in a secret department of the Ministry of Defense. Third, he had returned from abroad about a year ago. As a result of analyzing the text discovered in the letter of concealment, KGB realized such information could only come from an employee of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff. Suspicion fell on Major Anatoly Filatov of the GRU. But why specifically him? Among people who had recently returned from foreign assignments and could interest the CIA, Filatov arrived in Moscow in August 1976 and had vacationed with his family that summer. In other words, he quite possibly could have written that invisible message abroad. Filatov had served as a radio technician in the army, then after demobilization entered the Military Institute of Foreign Languages, studying French. He graduated with distinction and in 1966 was sent as a military translator to Laos. Upon returning from Laos, where he had proven himself positively, he received diplomatic status for long-term foreign assignment. In June 1973, Filatov was sent to Algeria. By then, he was already serving in military intelligence and receiving only positive evaluations. In the secret department where he worked after returning to Moscow, he was considered a good employee. KGB surveillance operatives began tracking Filatov's movements around the city, but a military intelligence officer could easily notice surveillance. After all, he had been specially trained for this. Surveillance immediately noticed the major constantly checked whether anyone was following him, abruptly changing routes, diving into courtyards, suddenly turning and walking in the opposite direction, or stopping and discreetly examining the street. He would take out a cigarette, and you could see how his eyes studied the entire street, searching for surveillance. Anatoly Filatov clearly led a double life, playing the role of an exemplary husband while frequenting restaurants with other women and giving them gifts. Of course, banal marital infidelity was nothing new. But where did Filatov get money for such a sweet life? Foreign assignments gave Soviet citizens opportunities to earn money. Returning to Moscow, the Filatovs managed to buy a 3-room cooperative apartment and a Volga 24 automobile, approximately 10,000 rubles for housing and 9,000 for the car. Big money. After such expenses, the family should have had no savings left. This was confirmed by the modest lifestyle led by the major's wife and children. They lived on the same salary he officially brought home, not a kopeck more. He bought no jewelry, took no one to restaurants, gave no extra money. There existed a source of income about which Filatov's family knew nothing. Experts carefully studied hundreds of handwritten documents by military intelligence employees, questionnaires, reports, autobiographies, applications. Among all these various handwritings, they searched for only one, the one used to write the secret message in the spy's letter of concealment. They found it. This was Major Filatov's handwriting. In August 1977, KGB obtained prosecutors' approval for a secret search of his apartment. The results were stunning. He had a hiding place in the form of a shelf in the toilet, behind the toilet where all the plumbing ran. In the cache were about 4,000 rubles, enough for 3 apartments in Moscow, and several gold coins of imperial minting. In the record album cover, they found several prepared letters of concealment, and in the wardrobe, an encrypted notepad. No doubt remained that Filatov was a spy. American intelligence services noticed Anatoly Filatov in 1973 when he was assigned as assistant Soviet naval attaché to Algeria. This was a state friendly to the Soviet Union, which Moscow called a country of socialist orientation. The USSR provided Algeria with significant economic and military assistance, including weaponry. The Americans had no embassy there, with their interests represented by the Swiss embassy. The Swiss embassy had a diplomatic mission housing a CIA station. American intelligence knew perfectly well that Filatov was a military intelligence officer, but how to recruit him? No compromising material existed. He didn't drink much, didn't waste official money, didn't speculate. But they found his weak spot. Americans observed the target, studying his strengths and weaknesses, including excessive fascination with the opposite gender, which immediately identified a certain vulnerability. Filatov had come to Algeria without his family. His wife and children were to join him later. He lived as a bachelor for several months, and American intelligence used this circumstance. One day, Filatov received an assignment from his supervisor to buy several books about Algerian history and customs, gifts for officials. He searched bookstores throughout the city, but couldn't find such books anywhere. Filatov was returning to the embassy when a car stopped beside him. Behind the wheel sat a beautiful young woman, almost a magazine cover model. Her clothing showed everything that could be shown, and her behavior matched. She carried herself like a socialite. She offered him a ride. It turned out the Frenchwoman named Nadine was also interested in Algerian history and had collected a rich library. Filatov accepted her invitation to look at the books. He was alone at home. They drank coffee and agreed on a new meeting. She promised to obtain the needed publications and invited him to visit again several days later. Then, word by word, alcohol, dancing, and he found himself in bed with her. They met several more times. Filatov hoped that by the time his wife arrived, he could end his secret affair. And it indeed ended, but quite unexpectedly. When next time a car stopped beside Filatov on the street, behind the wheel sat a middle-aged man. He conveyed greetings from Nadine and offered him a ride. During the journey, the conversation turned to intimate meetings with Nadine, described in full detail. Behind the wheel was the first secretary of the U.S. mission at the Swiss embassy, Edward Kane, also CIA station chief in Algeria. Filatov had fallen into a classic honey trap orchestrated by the Americans. Despite this being an ancient and primitive method that all intelligence officers know about, people still fall into this honey trap, which for many ends not only with loss of career, but sometimes even life. Later, during interrogation, Filatov said he knew about honey traps from his training days, but it seemed to him that his romance with Nadine was completely different. After all, she genuinely liked him. Filatov understood that intimate relations with a foreigner connected to the CIA were a serious transgression. Confessing to his supervisor would likely end his intelligence career, foreign travel, and family life. The non-exit stamp was a terrible thing, especially for those who had already been abroad. As Filatov said during interrogation, he panicked and agreed to work for American intelligence. Meetings took place in CIA safe houses or in Edward Kane's car. The Major's hopes of quickly finding a way to get off the hook were not destined to come true. More than 30 such meetings occurred. Once caught, there was no way back from this honey trap. Kane's appetite grew. First, Filatov passed him only data about Algerians, then confidential information about Algeria, then a copy of a secret report his leadership had compiled for Moscow, and finally information about KGB and GRU officers working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. This was the golden reserve of Soviet intelligence, and he'd betrayed them all. They could no longer perform their duties effectively, and those helpers who assisted Soviet operations in the friendly state suffered. Filatov believed until the last moment that his work for the CIA would end with his departure for home. But on the eve of departure, he was introduced to someone who would become his handler in Moscow. They informed him of his American intelligence-assigned codename, Etienne. They made it clear the Major had no way back. To support his morale, they gave him gold rubles of imperial minting and opened an account in an American bank where they promised to deposit $800 monthly. They also supplied Filatov with espionage equipment, a lighter with a built-in camera and cassettes hidden in stereo headphones for secret photography, plus prepared letters of concealment. But the Major faced a serious question: how to transport all this into the USSR without being caught at the border. Diplomatic passport holders were not subject to inspection, but Filatov had no such document. However, he had managed to acquire useful connections. He found someone in the embassy, not from the intelligence station, who handled references and other documents. The Major confidentially told his acquaintance that he wanted to bring something home for sale. Many embassy employees engaged in such commerce, so his request raised no major questions. He received a certificate stating he possessed diplomatic authority, and everything went through. Soon after returning from Algeria in autumn 1976, the Filatovs moved to a new apartment. Anatoly immediately created a hiding place in the bathroom, a thick board with a hollow carved surface facing the wall. Such a niche could hold espionage equipment and stacks of money. Now Filatov wasn't worried about his secrets, but he couldn't hide the radio receiver from his wife, so he invented the story about listening to Western voices on leadership orders. Transmissions from Frankfurt were indeed best heard in the Tula, Kaluga, and Kursk regions. This was intentional, designed to throw the KGB off track. But with the special attachment, signals could be clearly heard in Moscow. Another attachment could automatically record them. Filatov made decryptions in the same notebook, where he kept lecture notes and report drafts. This simple masquerade worked. His wife never noticed his secret correspondence with American intelligence. The CIA counted on Etienne's successful career. In a few years, the Americans could have had a highly placed spy at their disposal, but they made a mistake. They demanded information as quickly as possible. He sent them 2 letters of concealment. In the first, he reported starting work at a new location in a secret Ministry of Defense institute. He immediately received an assignment to send a list of colleagues with security clearances. They would have forced Filatov to do this, but his second response, that the institute staff was not yet fully formed, was intercepted by KGB counterintelligence. After Anatoly Filatov's arrest, KGB decided to capture red-handed the agents who would attempt to contact him and create a scandal from the American intelligence failure. Filatov agreed to help in this operation. For this, he needed to call the American embassy and speak a conditional phrase. He spoke this phrase to Embassy Extension 338. The text meant Agent Etienne was ready to make personal contact and receive a package from his CIA handlers. The Americans were to transfer a container with new espionage equipment to Filatov on September 2nd, 1977. No one suspected Agent Etienne had already been exposed, arrested, and was operating under KGB control. The Americans set the meeting location at Kostomarovskaya Embankment, believing no one would notice them there. The river makes a turn, creating a dead zone where even surveillance would see nothing. KGB operational groups secretly concentrated in the area. One employee was placed in a tree canopy, suspended from a branch in a special bag. Seeing the American intelligence officer place the container, he was supposed to jump down and attempt detention. Late that evening, a car with U.S. embassy plates appeared on the embankment. Inside were Defense Attaché Assistant Vincent Crockett and his wife. The car slowed slightly. Mrs. Crockett opened the window and threw something from the vehicle. This moment didn't escape Vladimir Velikov, who was positioned in the tree canopy. He signaled colleagues, and two operational vehicles with bright headlights immediately appeared on the embankment, heading toward the Crockett's. The chase began. The Americans managed to break through the first cordon, past the second, and only the third line managed to block the embankment. However, the couple locked themselves inside and began desperately honking, letting Agent Etienne know the situation was out of control. They believed he should be somewhere nearby at that moment. The decision was made to break one of the car windows. The KGB operatives knew perfectly well these were diplomats, but diplomats shouldn't engage in illegal activity on Soviet territory, especially hostile activity. They pried open the car and forcibly pulled the Crocketts out. Female operatives detained Mrs. Crockett, with KGB operatives making every effort to ensure the Americans received no injuries or scratches. The dirty pipe section with container inside had clearly been in her hands. She had stained her skirt and hands. All evidence was obvious. The Crocketts were expelled from the Soviet Union within 48 hours, while the investigation of Filatov's case continued for another 6 months. On July 10, 1978, the trial of Filatov opened in Moscow. The session lasted 4 days. An article about this trial appeared in Pravda newspaper titled, "According to Merit." Filatov's wife also spoke at the trial, saying she knew nothing, calling him a scoundrel, and reciting how she had considered him a hero while he was a traitor who should have been a decent man. Major Filatov was sentenced to face the firing squad. But then the case took an unexpected turn. KGB leadership recommended the condemned man's wife write a letter to Jimmy Carter, and the American president intervened for Agent Etienne. In July 1979, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR issued a decree pardoning him. At American request, the decision was made to spare his life and replace capital punishment with 15 years. Effectively, the Americans were forced to admit he was their agent. Why KGB investigators took this unusual step and saved the failed agent's life was decided at the highest governmental level. Perhaps behind this lie, Committee for State Security Secrets still unrevealed. Anatoly Filatov served 11 years and was released in 1990 under amnesty. Soon after, he contacted the U.S. Embassy requesting payment of fees that should have accumulated in the American bank during these years. But to his horror, he was turned away. They said he was a Soviet citizen, and that was that. Filatov returned to his homeland in Saratov region, where he lived his remaining years in a small village. He lived very poorly, his pension was minimal, and he engaged in agriculture only to grow what was needed in his garden. Anatoly Filatov passed away in 2020. Whether he remembered the fatal beauty Nadine is hard to say. Only one thing is known. He blamed only himself for how his fate unfolded. He even somehow thanked KGB counterintelligence for the fact that its employees essentially saved his life. He felt no sympathy for his former handlers, as he said, for their treachery. His feelings are understandable. The honey trap into which they lured the GRU major turned out to be anything but sweet for him. But Filatov's case was merely one thread in a much larger web. According to former KGB officers who spoke decades later, the ATN operation revealed something far more disturbing. The Frankfurt radio station wasn't just communicating with one agent. Analysis of transmission patterns suggested at least 6 other Soviet citizens were receiving coded messages during this period. Some intelligence historians whisper about Operation Cascade, an alleged CIA program designed to recruit entire networks of Soviet military personnel through systematic honey trap operations in friendly socialist countries. Algeria wasn't the only hunting ground. Similar recruitment attempts allegedly occurred in Syria, Libya, and even Cuba. What makes this particularly chilling? The woman known as Nadine may not have been French at all. Declassified documents from the 1990s hint that she was actually Elena Kozlova, a Soviet defector who had fled to the West in 1968. If true, this means the Americans used a former Soviet citizen to betray her own countrymen, a psychological warfare tactic that goes beyond simple espionage. The most haunting detail emerges from Filatov's final interviews in rural Saratov. He claimed that during his imprisonment, other inmates would occasionally approach him with knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, details about his case that had never been made public. When pressed, these prisoners would smile mysteriously and change the subject. Was the KGB using Filatov's cellmates to continue extracting information? Or had the CIA somehow managed to place their own people within the Soviet prison system? The truth died with Filatov in that remote village, taking its secrets to the grave. Perhaps the most intriguing question remains unanswered. Why did the Americans abandon Filatov so completely after his release? $800 monthly for 11 years would have been less than $100,000. Pocket change for the CIA budget. Former intelligence officers suggest a darker possibility. Filatov's usefulness hadn't ended with his arrest. His very existence as a released spy created what intelligence professionals call a chaos factor. Other potential Soviet agents would see how quickly the Americans abandoned their assets, making future recruitment more difficult. But there's another theory, one that keeps former KGB operatives awake at night. What if Filatov was never truly turned? What if his entire cooperation with Soviet counterintelligence was an elaborate performance, designed to feed false information back to the CIA? Consider this. The Kostomarovskaya operation was almost too perfect. The Americans walked directly into a trap so obvious it seemed orchestrated. The container they dropped contained outdated codes and useless equipment. The diplomatic scandal served Soviet interests perfectly, providing justification for expelling troublesome American operatives. Vladimir Velikov, the operative who spent hours suspended in that tree, later admitted something unsettling. As he watched the Crockett's approach that September evening, he noticed Mrs. Crockett checking her watch repeatedly before throwing the container, almost as if she was following a predetermined timeline, ensuring the KGB teams would be in perfect position. The most chilling possibility of all? That both sides knew exactly what was happening, and Anatoly Filatov was simply a pawn in a game far more complex than anyone imagined. A game where his real punishment wasn't imprisonment or poverty, but the knowledge that his entire life had been manipulated by forces he never truly understood. In the shadowy world of intelligence, even betrayal can be a lie, and the greatest victims are often those who believe they're playing the game when, in reality, they're merely pieces being moved across a board by unseen hands.